Hello humans, and welcome back to the Cosmic Tortoise podcast. I'm here in Orange, Australia, on my way back to New Zealand from Europe, and this podcast is with Professor Stanley Krippner. Stanley was on the podcast earlier this year in episode number 6. Stanley is kind of a legend. He's 85 years old. He was friends with Alan Watts, with Albert Hofmann, who's the inventor of LSD. He knew Timothy Leary. He's known and has interacted with many interesting people. He toured around with the Grateful Dead. He did interesting research on telepathy and dreams and hypnosis, and he's studied and talked with over 100 shamans around the world. He's really a really fascinating character. And I had the privilege of meeting Stanley in Vienna around a month ago. Stanley invited me along to a conference that he was speaking at about shamanism and traditional healing, which I attended one lecture, but unfortunately it was all in German. So I spent the day drinking coffee and researching teleodynamics, which hopefully will be another podcast in the future. Stanley was so kind to show me around the treasury in Vienna and showed me a bunch of artifacts. He knew everything about the artifacts. And we also visited the Historic Art Museum. The Historic Art Museum in Vienna is really mind-blowingly good. It's a magnificent building, and it's filled with just all the masters of classical European art. There was a lady in there recreating the Tower of Babel painting, which just blew my mind, the amount of detail. And she said she'd been working on it for months already. I think there's a picture of it on the Instagram. And the treasury was great. There was a hilarious section where there was a family that had heirlooms, a royal family that had heirlooms that were not to be given away under any circumstance. And one of the heirlooms was a unicorn horn. This thing was like 2 meters tall, and obviously it wasn't a unicorn horn, it was actually a narwhal horn. And I think it was in the family for centuries and was never given away because it was so precious. Stanley suggested we do another podcast, which I was more than happy to do. So we went to his hotel and hung out, and we chatted about a bunch of stuff. I decided to hit Stanley with a few of the hard questions. I hit him with free will. I hit him with the influence that non-human entities have on humans and on the world. We talked about the nature of life and the difference between life and matter in the universe, and how to find meaning in an increasingly unpredictable world. Stanley's such a clear thinker, and not to mention just a great guy, great human, full of vitality, especially at 85, and at times he's just absolutely hilarious as well. He has such a huge body of knowledge, and I feel as though I only scratched the surface with him, and hopefully sometime in the future I'll get the opportunity to chat with him again. But until then, here he is, Stanley Krippner. Where could we start? I wanted to get a couple of your opinions or ideas on a few big subjects. So one of them, let's start with free will. Let's get deep. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious if you're on the camp of free will existing or not.
Well, it all depends on how you define free will. In popular parlance, free will implies that somebody has the capacity to make a conscious and rational decision, usually after looking at various alternatives and looking at the evidence to back up various alternatives. we know that this is very simplistic for a number of reasons. First of all, Sigmund Freud correctly noted that there are unconscious processes that determine our attitudes and our behavior and even our feelings that we really don't have conscious control over. Mm. And so when somebody says, I dated that girl because I knew that she would be compatible with me, and I think we will be a good combination. If you probe a little deeper, according to Freud, you might find out that that girl reminded the young man of his lover, of his mother, or a previous lover, somebody in his past. And so what he thought was free will was not exactly predetermined, but was heavily influenced by his past experiences. And I think that there's been a great deal of experimental evidence since Freud's day to show how choices that we make can be related to past experiences, whether they be choices in mate selection, or whether they be choices in career, or whether they be choices in simply random behavior like food tastes or color preferences. Now, another problem with that concept is that so many people in the world today really don't have free will. Look at the refugees who are streaming into Germany, for example. You might say, well, that is free will. They could have stayed in the Middle East and been killed. Yes, that's true. But they made the decision to make the arduous trip, and on that arduous trip there were very, very few alternatives to them. They had to exist thanks to the kindness of strangers and benevolent governments like the German government that found a place for them to stay, to live, to eat, and maybe some extra luxuries like going to school or having health care. As you can see, I'm approaching your topic from a number of different sides. More recently, a physiologist by the name of Benjamin Libet found that when people believe they're making a conscious decision, that decision has already been made a few seconds earlier. Mm-hmm. And he did this by very sophisticated brain scanning technology. So the more one looks into it, the less absolute free will seems to be an option. But for people who really prefer the notion of free will, the news isn't all bad. Benjamin Libet's experiments have been found to have had several gaps in them. So it's not an absolute that a person will make the decision before being aware of it consciously. Also, Freud's determinism is something that has several gaps in it because his conclusions are best looked at in retrospect, not predictive. If you take somebody's background and say, this person is bound to mate such and such a mate selection, it doesn't always work out that way. Now, a better predictor, believe it or not, is genetic. When you study identical twins, you find out that when it comes to mate selection, a man or a woman will choose his husband or his wife very much in concord with what the sibling did, even if the siblings were separated at birth. And this is so remarkable that sometimes their choice of mate is so much alike that they could be sisters or brothers. Rarely, but not all that rare, they even pick women or men with a similar name, similar body build, similar facial construction. So I think that there can be a genetic predisposition that even outweighs the Freudian psychodynamic. And so what we do in face of all of this evidence, I think that here we go back to William James, the first great American psychologist, and his advice was, well, even if things are predetermined, we must act as if we had free will.
Yes, yeah.
And that is good for our morale, and also it's good for our responsibility. It's a slippery slope if we say everything is predetermined. Then a mass murderer could say, well, I was born that way, or this was in my genes, or this is in my upbringing. I was raised that way. That doesn't cut the ice. People have to be responsible for their actions. And I'm an extremist on this. I think that even if somebody has a mental illness, they cannot be let off scot-free. I think they have to be responsible for their actions if they commit a crime. And again, we don't know the whole picture when it comes to human nature. So why can we assume that a person who, shall we say, is impoverished or is mentally ill or who is the victim of one's circumstances shouldn't be held responsible for an absolutely dreadful crime? I think that they should be treated humanely and mercifully and may be given a chance for transformation, but they're not to be let off scot-free, and they're not to be put into a home for the criminally insane unless that's a therapeutic session. In San Francisco several years ago, we had a perfect example of what I'm talking about. The mayor of San Francisco was assassinated. Harvey Milk, who was the first gay member of the city council, was assassinated by a ex-police officer by the name of Dan White, who was angry at both of them because he couldn't get his old job back on the city council. You know that his lawyer got him off free because he was eating so much food with sugar in, especially Twinkies.
Yes.
And the jury went along with that, unbelievably, that he was the victim of his diet. And this is now called the Twinkie defense. So he got off scot-free. He and his wife went to Fisherman's Wharf and set up a snack stand specializing in potatoes and French fries. But nobody would buy it because he had such a bad reputation in the city. And people shunned him. And he became so depressed, eventually he just shot himself. So in the end, the Twinkie defense actually worked against him. Maybe he ate too many Twinkies the night before he shot himself. So, in direct answer to your question, our choices certainly are heavily influenced by our genetics, by our environment, and by our childhood experiences. Heavily influenced. But we still need to act as if we had free will for our betterment and the betterment of society.
Great.
And remember what I said, all the evidence isn't in. We still don't know enough to make a final decision.
Yes.
So whenever the evidence is incomplete, there's what we call wiggle room, and so there's enough wiggle room to say, well, we certainly have enough free will to be held responsible for our decisions.
Yeah. Oh, that's That's great. Something that also comes into people's choices and influences the world is this idea of I'm curious what you think about the entities that live between the cracks. These can exist in the subconscious of a person. These can exist in people with multiple personality disorder. These can be large corporate bodies that become an entity. They become a sum of many seemingly unrelated parts. A human body is this in that it has many cells and also many bacteria, which creates this entity in the middle that has some sort of guidance over the whole lot. I'm curious where the concept of entities and gods and their influence on humans in history, where that sort of emerges. Is it just sort of a random emergence in the mind of humans because of this collective thing, or why do we have why do these non-conscious entities or non-physical entities have such a huge influence on our world?
I want to make sure I heard your word correctly. Are you talking about empathy?
Entities, such as a corporate entity or like a god could be considered an entity if enough people believe in a god that can have an influence on humans, or an entity in the mind of a multiple personality disorder person, etc., etc.
All right, I guess the best way that I could answer that is when we use the word entity, we're talking about a social construct. And when we talk about a corporation as being an entity, that's a construct that society has created. And when very rich people say that a corporation has the same laws as a person does, that's not anything that's automatically given. That's not a law or rule of nature. That, again, is a social construct. That is something that is determined, for better or for worse, by law, and in the United States by a recent decision of the U.S. Supreme Court, which many groups are now trying to overturn, that indicated, that ruled that the corporation has, in many domains, the same right as a person. Well, this is not something that is a law of nature. This is a result of human laws, and it doesn't exist in every country in the world. Now, to get down to personalities, you'd start off with a saying attributed to the Buddha: when you meditate, every breath you take is a chance to recreate yourself. And so the entity that we call human beings, this is something that is malleable. It's subject to change. You mentioned what used to be called multiple personalities, now called dissociative identity disorders. And this is an extreme example of what we also call subpersonalities, entities within the human psyche that are semi-independent of other aspects of the human psyche. People generally think, well, a person is the same from day to day, and if I meet my friend tomorrow, my friend will be the same as he or she was today. Not necessarily true. The person could have a bipolar disorder and might be in the manic phase one day, the depressive phase the other day. And they behave very differently depending on whether they're up or whether they're down. Or they could have taken a drug of some sort, a medical drug or a street drug or a recreational drug, and under the influence of the drug they might be behaving completely different, almost completely differently. So I don't think we can assume that there is a solid, stable entity from person to person that exists throughout time. To go even further than that, in the Western world, we think of a human being as ending where the skin ends. Not so in many other parts of the world. Native Americans, before the Europeans invaded North and South America, thought that the individual was a part of a clan and a family and a part of nature. That the lines separating one person from another were very, very fuzzy, very permeable. And the Native American prayers talk about blessings to our brothers and sisters, and our brothers and sisters who crawl on the ground, who walk on four legs, who swim in the ocean, who stand tall in the forest, etc., 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 including all life as part of an individual, as part of the family. So there are even some people who regard the physical body as a social construction. And because different parts of the body act as if they're independent from other parts of the body from time to time. And that also talk about free will, they also act as if they have volition. If you study the stomach, if you study the kidneys, if you study the lungs, the heart, etc., you find that the cells are constantly organizing and reorganizing themselves, and they're doing this in a way that generally leads to the health and well-being of the person. And then, of course, there are connections between the various parts of the body, and it's a system, but the system can be viewed as an entire system, or it can be viewed as the parts. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And, of course, the parts are more than the sum of the whole, because the parts interact together. Also, when you talk about what an entity is, what about the so-called aliens from outer space? Well, I don't know if they exist or not. Some people are very convinced one way or another. All I'm saying is if there are visitors from outer space, they would certainly qualify as entities. Mm-hmm. Now, what are the characteristics of an entity? To use a psychological term, they have agency. And by agency, we mean they have the ability to behave, they have the ability to, in some sense of the word, reflect, and to provide information. I think that here we're dealing with words that in another language would use different words and perhaps even better than the English language, but I guess the bottom line of all of this is that what it qualifies as an entity depends on the culture that you're in and the belief system that you subscribe to. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That there, in my opinion, there is nothing that automatically can be called an entity without the definition and the social construction that goes with it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, the last time we talked, you mentioned the pattern that connects. And this is some research done by Deacon and Bateson, I believe.
Gregory Bateson, that's the name, yes.
Yes, and Bateson and Deacon have there's a very interesting theory of teleodynamics, and this is a theory you may be familiar with, on what distinguishes life from non-living matter. And one of the really interesting points that he made was that life seems to go against the second law of thermodynamics. It's negentropic, or it goes against entropy and becomes more complex.
Yes.
This is I guess one of the many miracles of what life is. But he seems to suggest that life has to have some sense of the future in order to self-sustain and to keep going. I'm wondering if you're familiar with this research and what your thoughts might be on it, on the distinction between living matter and why it moves forward and becomes more complex.
Well, in the first place, I think that Gregory Bateson, who, as you know, is a friend of mine, and I'm still friends with his daughter, Nora Bateson, and I also knew both of his wives and his other daughter, so I'm always happy to talk about Gregory Bateson, even though I'm not a specialist on any of his areas. But when he says that life goes against the second law of thermodynamics, absolutely right, because it defies entropy. And so life is something that over the millennia was a challenge to emerge. And so one can see why there are such popular exotic theories about life coming from other planets. Well, then where did the life emerge on other planets? I think that this is something that some people would give a supernatural explanation for. Well, this is how God works. Fine, but that's not a good enough explanation. I think that, among other things, there's a little bit of a problem here, because the line between life and non-life is not all that clear. What about viruses? Do they count as life or do they count as non-life? There's a debate going on about viruses, and you can make a case either way. I think that the best way I can answer your question is to go back to Darwinian evolution and note that from Darwin's point of view, evolution is always favoring what is adaptable. And when creatures emerged from the sea and started to get sea legs and walk on land, the ones who were able to do this died off. The ones who could do this passed on their genes to succeeding generations. And you might say, why didn't they just stay in the ocean? Why did life even come into the picture? Well, that's not the way the world works. The way the world works is to evolve toward more and more complexity. And it's just the way things are. I think that if entropy had its way, the world would have collapsed upon itself millennia ago. But that would have not been adaptable. It would not have helped survival. And for survival to take place, at some point along the way, entropy had to be superseded, and the second law of thermodynamics had to be not exactly repealed, but to have a footnote or an exception associated with it.
Yeah, sure.
Now, once evolution produced living creatures, there's something else that comes into the picture that's extremely interesting, and that is it was more adaptable for living creatures to work together and help each other than it was for them to fight each other. And when it gets to the level of human beings and proto-human beings, cooperation was adaptable, more adaptable than conflict. conflict kills off too many people. Cooperation helps them survive. Darwin was very upset when the term survival of the fittest became popular, because that's not what he wrote at all. He did not like the term. And instead, he stressed cooperation, and in his work, such terms as cooperation, collaboration, and love appear hundreds of times. Survival of the fittest appears exactly twice, and both negatively. So sometimes you just have to say that's the way things are.
Yeah.
And go on from there.
Yeah.
And in terms of the term entity, once humans came on the scene and began to think and reflect, they had to survive. And to survive, things had to make sense. They attributed meaning to phenomena. Even chance occurrences, like finding an albino frog. Well, that was something unusual, but they had to give that meaning. So an albino frog might have been connected with a piece of good luck. Okay, the albino frog is a god that's giving us good luck. Or if bad luck occurred at the same time, well, the albino frog is a demon that's giving us bad luck. So over the millennia, part of evolution, when it came especially to humans, was the necessity to provide meaning. And it was more important for people to provide meaning than it was to look for truth. Looking for truth is disciplined inquiry. That came much, much later. Science came much, much later. You might say that myth eventually evolved into science. And the twin was magic, and magic eventually evolved into technology. But things started off on what we would now consider sort of irrational belief systems and sort of irrational connections that people made. But without that connections, life would have been meaningless. If life were meaningless, people wouldn't have thought well enough of themselves to try to save their lives. So attributing meaning to things, even incorrect meaning from our point of view, attributing meaning to things was a survival mechanism, and it was adaptable. So here we are today, and we are now in the age of science, and so for something to be demonstrated as, quote, true, untrue, it has to pass several scientific tests. And as a result, we have so-called scientific laws and theories. So we're finally getting to where at least a small portion of people on Earth are taking truth seriously.
Yes.
The majority still are in the era of myth and magic, I have to say.
Yes. Would you have any advice for young and curious people heading into this increasingly unpredictable future, and how they could find a good balance between meaning and truth?
I think that these are very uncertain times, and I think that the future is very uncertain in many, many ways. There are immense problems facing the Earth, whether we want to admit it or not. There are immense problems facing Europe. For example, Europe was heading toward a population balance, and in some countries, 1.5 or 1.8 children per couple was becoming standard. But now we have 1 million refugees from the Middle East come in, most of whom are Muslim and who believe in large families. So Some people have predicted within 100 years Europe will be Muslim, simply because the population is going to grow in that direction because they have no concern for limiting number of offspring. And I'm not saying this in a judgmental way, I'm just saying these are the facts of life. These are two outlooks on family growth and family planning that are in contradiction, and I don't think that planners have anticipated what's going to happen several decades from now with this huge Islamic population that's come into Europe. Mm-hmm. Yes, of course, we hope they will be assimilated. We hope they will be assimilated, but will this assimilation also move into the family planning era? Mm-hmm. Okay, that's just one problem. And then we have climate change. And even though there are many, many opponents of climate change who don't believe it's really going to happen, the predominance of scientific thinking say not only is it going to happen, but it's happening already. And it's responsible for many of the floods, many of the hurricanes, many of the tsunamis going on. And coastal cities, especially the United States, are threatened. Before the end of the century, they might not even be here. Again, a lot of people with power, especially in the U.S. government, deny all of this. But I think the real debate is a little different. The real debate is, yes, climate change is real. To what extent is climate change human-produced, and to what extent is it just a part of the natural rhythm? Mm-hmm. And I think you can make a case that human intervention has little to do with it. I don't agree with that case, but at least the case can be made. Mm-hmm. I don't think you can make a case that climate change is not happening. Mm-hmm. No, to me that's an irrational belief. That is, if you're looking for truth, that's not where you're going to find truth. So, back to your question, what is a young person to do faced with all of the crises and all of the unpredictable problems that exist? Look at all the young people who have gone to those concerts in the United States, France, other countries, and have been shot down by a crazy killer. Their whole life is over, and all of their plans for the future are gone. And this is because of some deranged person who got his hands on guns or other lethal devices, and for some bizarre reason, sometimes religious, sometimes philosophical, sometimes just crazed thinking, began to kill as many people as possible. I think that, in my opinion, I've always realized that life hangs by a thread. It might be over at any time. I've had many very close calls in my day. I think that if I were to give advice, which I rarely do, I don't tell people how to run their lives. That's not my mission on earth.
Let's call it tips. Some tips,
okay.
Maybe.
But I would say, live every day fully because it might be your last. But that does not prevent you from planning for the future. But when you plan for the future, have several different scenarios in mind. Okay, you're planning for a particular career. What happens if that career disappears because of artificial intelligence, because of robots, because of automation? What would you do next if that career isn't there when you're ready for it? Again, I don't think that people are taking artificial intelligence and robots seriously enough. Mm. Within a few decades, they will be able to perform most human functions and perform very, very well. And what's going to happen to all the people then who are out of work and out of jobs? You don't see this in the headlines of the newspapers, but if you look at sober reports of futurists, this is in the works. This is in the cards. And it's going to hit industrialized nations first. And eventually it's going to seep into the developing countries. And it might It might not take more than 100 years for this to happen. I think this is a challenge. What are you going to do with all of those extra people who are suddenly or gradually out of work? So anyway, back to advice. Point number 2, plan several alternatives in terms of your long-range planning. And then the third advice I think that I would give is, what can you do to bring more joy and love into your life day by day? Don't limit yourself to purely cognitive planning, because that might yield to fun in the long term, but what can you do to have some fun and joy today? Who can you have sex with? What show can you go that you enjoy? What can you create? What kind deed can you do for somebody? This is something you can do on a day-by-day basis to really fulfill your mission as a human being who has feelings as well as thoughts. So one of my mottos is, don't postpone joy. It might not come up again.
Brilliant. On the last final note, do you have any strategies for people to find a balance between truth seeking and meaning? Because as you said previously, we're far too focused on meaning, and then we've only really recently been seeking the truth properly. And some people that seek too much of the truth can end up being, if they look at things too materialistically, they can often end up feeling depressed and like there's no meaning to life. Do you have any ideas how someone could find a nice middle ground between the two?
As I say, from an evolutionary point of view, meaning is absolutely important. And if people cannot find meaning in their life, they're on their way to suicide, on their way to sheer hedonism, on their way to irresponsible behavior. And so not only do they have to find meaning, they have to find, I think, some sort of constructive meaning that will not only bring meaning into their life, but will bring happiness and joy into their life. And I think that this is best done by looking at oneself as part of a social fabric in terms of not only helping oneself, but helping other people, and taking what love they have and spreading it around. I think that this is where we will find the most profound meaning, and this is also an avenue to truth. Because I think that if you can see the cause and effect between what you do and what the results of what you do are, and if you do something that brings not only you happiness, but other people happiness and satisfaction and fulfillment, then there is some truth involved in that.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Okay?
All right. Thanks, Stanley. Thanks very much.